Easy now. I've got you.
Why are you doing this for me?
You shouldn't be alone right now.
I'm staying.
Dust swirling over the Dakota plains choked the life from the Caldwell homestead long before the local bank threatened to take it. But nothing broke Josephine quite like the snapping of her own bones beneath heavy iron, leaving her utterly defenseless in a ruthless, unforgiving frontier. October of 1884 brought a bitter chill to the shadow of Spearfish Canyon, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow. Josephine Caldwell stood in the center of 60 acres of dying wheat, the wind tearing at the frayed edges of her wool shawl. She was 26, a widow of 14 months, and entirely alone. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man with a weak chest. The prairie winter had taken him swiftly, leaving Josephine with nothing but a half-finished farmhouse, a stubborn Belgian draft horse, and a crushing mortgage held by Amos Burnett. Burnett was not merely a banker in the nearby settlement of Deadwood. He was a vulture in a tailored broadcloth suit. For months, he had been systematically choking out the smaller homesteaders along the ridge, hoarding the water rights, and waiting for the inevitable foreclosures. Josephine's land sat directly over a pristine underground spring, making her property the crown jewel Burnett coveted most. He had given her until the first week of November to produce the $300 owed, a sum she could only hope to raise by bringing in the autumn harvest single-handedly. Survival demanded a grueling, unbroken rhythm of labor, and Josephine had hardened herself to it. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to the gentle work of embroidery, back in street. Louis were now calloused and stained with the dark, rich earth of the Dakotas. But sheer willpower could not negotiate with exhaustion, nor could it prevent the cruel unpredictability of the Wild West. The catastrophe occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. Josephine was attempting to hitch her massive Belgian horse, Samson, to the heavy iron McCormick Reaper. The sky above was a bruised purple, threatening an early blizzard. Desperation made her movements hurried. She was threading the thick leather traces through the iron singletree when two riders crested the southern ridge. Even from a distance, Josephine recognized the distinctive black dusters of Burnett's hired muscle, Silas and Coley. They didn't approach the property line respectfully. They spurred their mounts into a gallop, riding aggressively along the barbed wire fence, whooping and hollering to stir up the dust. Samson, already nervous from the dropping barometric pressure, flattened his ears. Josephine tightened her grip on the heavy leather reins, stepping between the horse and the heavy iron wheels of the Reaper to soothe him. "Steady, boy. Easy now," she murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Then Coley drew his Colt revolver and fired a single deafening shot into the air. The crack of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls was like a physical blow. Samson reared, a ton of terrified muscle and bone plunging forward. Josephine had the heavy leather reins wrapped securely around her forearms for leverage, a fatal mistake. As the massive horse bolted, she was violently jerked forward. She slammed hard into the iron chassis of the Reaper. Before she could scream, she lost her footing. The heavy wooden tongue of the Reaper violently swung around, trapping her hands against the iron-spoked wheel. Samson lunged again, dragging the heavy machinery a full 3 feet. The sickening, wet crunch of bone snapping echoed over the plains, louder to Josephine than the gunshot. She collapsed into the dirt as Samson finally snapped the leather traces and bolted toward the open prairie. The pain did not register immediately. It was preceded by a profound, terrifying numbness. Josephine lay in the dry earth, gasping for air, the world spinning in sickening circles of gray and brown. When she finally found the courage to look down, a primal sob tore from her throat. Both of her hands were grotesquely mangled. Her left wrist was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle, the skin pulled taut over shattered bone. The fingers of her right hand were crushed, rapidly swelling and turning a deep, horrifying shade of violet. The skin was broken in several places, weeping dark, sluggish crimson onto the thirsty Dakota soil. The riders had paused at the edge of the property, watching her fall. They didn't cross the fence. They didn't offer aid. After a long, silent moment, they simply turned their horses and rode back toward Deadwood, leaving her in the dirt. It was a clear, silent message. The land was theirs, and she was meant to die on it. For 3 days, Josephine Caldwell lived a waking nightmare. She managed to drag herself back to the farmhouse, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust as she crawled the final 100 yards. Using her teeth, her elbows, and sheer, agonizing increments of movement, she managed to wrap her ruined hands in torn strips of petticoat linen, binding them to flat pieces of kindling wood in a desperate attempt to splint the fractures. But a farm requires hands. Without them, the homestead quickly became a prison. She could not operate the heavy cast-iron pump to draw water. She could not strike a match to light the stove. She could not milk the screaming, uncomfortable cow in the barn. By the third day, a severe fever had set in. The makeshift bandages were crusted and filthy, and the pain had transformed from a sharp agony into a constant throbbing roar that consumed her mind. She lay on the rough pine floorboards near the front door, shivering violently despite the sweat pooling at her collar. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the loose window panes. Josephine stared at the wooden ceiling beams, realizing with quiet, devastating clarity that Amos Burnett had won. She was going to die of thirst and infection, surrounded by the very wheat she had grown to save her life. Gideon Cole did not belong to the plains. He was a creature of the high timber, a man carved from the rugged granite of the Black Hills. Standing 6'4" in worn buckskins that smelled sharply of pine pitch and wood smoke, Gideon had spent the last decade trapping beaver and hunting elk far above the tree line. He wore his dark hair long, tied back with a strip of leather, and a thick, unruly beard hid the sharp, angular lines of his jaw. Slung across his broad back was a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, a weapon he trusted far more than any human being. He was making a rare descent into the valleys. Winter was approaching fast, and he needed salt, coffee, and lead from the mercantile in town. His usual route would have bypassed the Caldwell farm entirely, but a rock slide near the northern pass had forced him to lead his heavily packed mule, Barnaby, through the lower basin. As Gideon emerged from the dense pine forest and stepped onto the perimeter of the homestead, his sharp eyes immediately caught the signs of distress. A mountain man survives by reading his environment, and the environment before him screamed of abandonment. The wheat was overripe, heavy heads bowing toward the soil, begging to the scythe. The barn door was swinging wildly on a broken hinge. But most alarming was the massive Belgian draft horse grazing aimlessly near the creek, trailing broken leather traces. Gideon tied Barnaby to a fence post and approached the farmhouse, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his hip. The silence was absolute, broken only by the lowing of a cow in desperate need of milking. He stepped onto the porch. "Hello, the house!" His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. No answer. He pushed the heavy oak door open. The interior was dim, the air stale and thick with the metallic scent of sickness. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the gloom. When they did, his breath hitched in his chest. Curled on the floor, barely conscious, was a woman. Her pale face was flushed with fever, her lips cracked and bleeding, but it was her arms that drew his horrified gaze. They were resting gingerly on her chest, wrapped in filthy, blood-stiffened rags and lashed to crude wooden splints. Her fingers, protruding from the bandages, were black with bruised blood and swollen to twice their normal size. Gideon dropped to his knees beside her, his massive frame dwarfing her fragile form. "Ma'am," he said softly, reaching out to touch her forehead. She was burning up. Josephine gasped, her eyes fluttering open. Through the haze of fever and pain, she saw a giant of a man draped in animal skins leaning over her. Panic, primal and sharp, flared in her chest. She kicked weakly, trying to push herself backward across the floorboards. "No," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Burnett, get out. I won't sign." "Easy," Gideon commanded, his tone calm but carrying absolute authority. "I ain't from no bank. My name is Gideon Cole. You're burning with fever, and your hands look like they took a trip through a rock crusher." He didn't wait for permission. He moved with a surprising, fluid grace for a man of his size. He retrieved a tin cup from his pack, went to the water barrel in the corner, noting grimly that it was nearly empty, and scooped up a small amount. Supporting her head with one large, calloused hand, he brought the cup to her cracked lips. Josephine drank greedily, coughing as the cool water hit her parched throat. As her mind cleared slightly, she looked at the stranger again. His eyes were a startling, piercing gray, bordered by deep weather lines. There was no pity in them, only a cool, calculating assessment of her condition. "How long?" he asked, nodding toward her mangled hands. Three days," Josephine whispered, the effort draining her. Hoarse spooked. "The Reaper!" Gideon swore softly under his breath. 3 days meant the bones had already begun to knit improperly. "I have to look at them, missus." "Caldwell," he said, reading the name carved into the wooden mantelpiece above the cold hearth. "If infection sets into the bone marrow, you'll lose the arms. Or your life." He drew his hunting knife, a wicked blade of forged steel. Josephine flinched, but Gideon only used it to carefully slice through the filthy linen rags binding her right hand. As the fabric peeled away, the true extent of the damage was revealed. The stench of stale blood and early suppuration filled the air. The swelling was massive, the skin tight and shiny. 2 fingers were dislocated, pointing at unnatural angles, and the heavy bruising along the wrist indicated a severe break. "This is going to hurt," Gideon said quietly, meeting her fevered gaze. "More than when it happened. I have to reset the joints, or you'll never hold a spoon again, let alone work this farm." Josephine squeezed her eyes shut. Tears leaked from the corners, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She had fought so hard, endured so much, and now she was entirely at the mercy of this wild man from the mountains. "Do it," she ground out, her voice trembling but resolute. Gideon worked quickly, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he manipulated the swollen flesh. He found the dislocated joints first. With a sharp, sudden pull and a sickening pop, he snapped the first finger back into its socket. Josephine screamed, a raw, ragged sound that tore her throat, her body arching off the floor. She clamped her teeth down hard on her own lip, tasting fresh copper. "Breathe," Gideon instructed, his brow furrowed in concentration. "One more! Pop!" Another ragged gasp from Josephine. Then came the wrist. Gideon gripped her forearm tightly with his left hand and clasped her crushed hand with his right. He pulled with steady, immense strength, stretching the contracted muscles until he felt the jagged edges of the broken bone align under the skin. He held it there, sweat beading on his own forehead, as he quickly used his teeth to tear fresh, clean cotton strips from a roll in his pack. He splinted the wrist expertly with straight branches he had gathered outside, binding it tight enough to hold but loose enough to allow the swelling to recede. He repeated the grueling process on her left hand, which, miraculously, was only severely fractured and not crushed. By the time he was finished, Josephine had passed out from the overwhelming pain, lying limp and silent on the floorboards. Gideon rocked back on his heels, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He looked around the desolate farmhouse, then out the window, at the dying wheat fields swaying in the wind. He thought of the high country, the peace of the alpine lakes, the deep snows that would soon blanket his solitary cabin. He looked down at the pale, broken woman on the floor. She had been fighting a war all by herself, defending her ground with nothing but raw grit. Slowly, Gideon stood up. He walked out to the front porch, untied Barnaby the mule, and began unloading his heavy packs. He carried his flour, his salt, his ammunition, and his thick wool blankets inside. He found the heavy cast-iron skillet and placed it on the cold stove. He had intended to be back in the mountains before the first freeze, but as he looked out over the sprawling, vulnerable homestead, Gideon Cole made a quiet, life-altering decision. The mountains could wait, the harvest could not. And whoever had driven this woman to the brink of death was going to find a very different kind of fight waiting for them. Fever broke on the 5th morning, leaving Josephine hollowed out but remarkably lucid. Sunlight streamed through the cracked window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing above her quilt. She was in her own bed, covered by a heavy, unfamiliar pelt of wolf fur. Her hands throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, heavily wrapped in clean white linen and immobilized by sturdy hickory splints. From outside, the steady, metallic clatter of the McCormick Reaper echoed across the basin. Pushing herself up with her elbows, she managed to stumble to the window. Out in the sprawling fields, the mountain man was working. Gideon Cole had stripped down to his linen undershirt, his broad shoulders bunching and releasing as he guided the massive Belgian draft horse through the golden rows. He worked with a relentless, mechanical efficiency that left Josephine breathless. He was not just saving her harvest. He was waging war against the encroaching winter and Amos Burnett's ticking clock. Pride warred with profound gratitude in Josephine's chest. She had built this life on independence, fighting tooth and nail to prove a woman could hold a homestead alone. Now, she was entirely reliant on a stranger who bathed her fevered face, spoon-fed her warm broth, and hauled her livelihood from the earth while she lay helpless. Days bled into a grueling rhythm. Gideon would work the fields from before dawn until the light completely failed, returning to the farmhouse covered in dust and chaff. Despite his exhaustion, he handled her care with a surprising, quiet tenderness. He would boil water, carefully unwrap her splints to check for infection, his large, rough fingers moving with deliberate care, and rebind them. "Bones are setting straight," Gideon murmured one evening, sitting beside her chair by the hearth. He was inspecting her left wrist, the firelight casting long shadows across his weathered face. "Swelling is down. You got lucky, Mrs. Caldwell." "Josephine," she corrected softly, her eyes tracing the deep lines around his mouth. "And luck had nothing to do with it, Mr. Cole. You saved my life. I don't know how I will ever repay you. The bank takes everything this harvest brings." Gideon looked up, his slate gray eyes meeting hers. "I didn't ask for payment, and Burnett ain't taking this land. Not while I'm standing on it." Trouble arrived 2 days before the November deadline. The temperature had plummeted, turning the ground hard as iron. Gideon was in the barn, repairing a broken singletree, when the sound of approaching hooves broke the stillness. Josephine, sitting on the porch with a blanket draped over her shoulders, felt her stomach drop. Silas and Coley trotted into the yard, their horses snorting plumes of white vapor. They wore arrogant smirks, clearly expecting to find a corpse or a woman driven mad by gangrene. "Well, look here," Coley sneered, resting his hand on his holster. "The widow Caldwell is still kicking. Heard you had a little accident with the machinery, ma'am. Boss sent us to see if you were ready to sign the deed over. Save you the trouble of starving." "Get off my property," Josephine said, her voice shaking but her spine rigid. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You ain't in no position to give orders. We're coming inside to get that signature, one way or another." He swung his leg over the saddle to dismount. Heavy timber creaked violently. The barn door swung open, revealing Gideon Cole. He held the heavy Sharps buffalo rifle casually in one hand, the barrel resting against his shoulder. He didn't shout. He didn't hurry. He simply walked into the yard, his massive frame blocking the path to the porch. "Gentlemen," Gideon rumbled, his voice low and dangerous, like boulders grinding together deep underground. "The lady asked you to leave." Coley froze, his hand hovering over his Colt. He sized up the mountain man, taking in the wolf pelts, the scarred leather, and the absolute lack of fear in Gideon's eyes. The Sharps rifle could punch a hole through a brick wall, let alone a man. "Who the hell are you?" Silas demanded, his bravado faltering. "I'm the harvest hand," Gideon replied flatly. "And the harvest is coming in. Tell Amos Burnett he'll have his $300 by Friday noon at the Deadwood Bank. If either of you ride within a mile of this fence line before then, I won't bother asking you to leave twice." Silence stretched tight across the frozen yard. Gideon leveled the rifle, the hammer clicking back with a sharp, deafening snap in the cold air. "Crazy mountain bastard," Coley muttered, pulling his horse's reins hard. "Burnett ain't gonna like this." They turned their mounts and spurred them back toward town, kicking up frozen clods of dirt. Gideon watched them until they were specks on the horizon, then slowly lowered the hammer of his rifle. He turned to look at Josephine. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with a fierce, burning light. At that moment, Gideon realized he wasn't just fighting for her land anymore. He was fighting for her. November arrived with the sharp bite of impending snow. Miraculously, the barn was full. Stacks of burlap sacks, heavy with threshed grain, reached toward the rafters. It represented exactly $320 of hard-won salvation. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, they would hitch the wagon, drive into Deadwood, and throw the money directly onto Amos Burnett's polished mahogany desk. Celebration, however, was a luxury the frontier rarely afforded. Night had fallen completely, blanketing the plains in oppressive darkness. Josephine was dozing in the rocking chair, her arms resting on pillows, while Gideon sharpened his hunting knife by the dying fire. The wind had picked up, howling down from Spearfish Canyon. Suddenly, Gideon stopped. He raised his head, his nostrils flaring. The sharp, acrid scent of sulfur and burning pitch cut through the drafty farmhouse. "Gideon?" Josephine asked, startled by his sudden movement. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward the door, snatching his rifle from the table. Throwing open the front door, the night was illuminated by a horrifying, violent orange glow. The eastern wall of the barn was engulfed in flames. Burnett hadn't waited for Friday. Realizing the crop was harvested and his legal claim was slipping away, he had sent his men under the cover of darkness to destroy the grain. If the wheat burned, Josephine couldn't pay. The land would default. "No!" Josephine screamed, pushing past Gideon onto the porch. The heat was already intense, rolling across the yard in stifling waves. Inside the burning structure, Samson, the draft horse, was screaming in terror, kicking violently against his stall. "Josephine, stay back!" Gideon roared. He dropped the rifle and sprinted toward the inferno. Time fractured into chaotic, desperate shards. Gideon threw his shoulder against the heavy sliding barn doors. They were barred from the outside, a deliberate trap set by Burnett's men. Cursing, Gideon grabbed a heavy felling axe from the chopping block and began hacking wildly at the thick wooden crossbar. Flames licked up the dry timber, racing toward the roof where the highly flammable hayloft sat. Smoke poured out in thick, choking black clouds. Gideon shattered the bar and shoved the doors open. He vanished into the smoke. Josephine stood on the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hands were useless. She couldn't haul water, she couldn't wield an axe. But she could not stand by while the man who had saved her life burned to death for her farm. Gritting her teeth against the dull agony in her arms, she ran toward the water pump. She couldn't grip the iron handle, but she positioned her bandaged forearms underneath it. Throwing her entire body weight downward, she forced the handle down. Water sputtered. She lifted her arms, crying out as the movement pulled her fractured bones, and threw her weight down again. Inside the barn, Gideon was losing the battle. He had managed to blindfold Samson with a grain sack and force the terrified horse out the back paddock doors, but the fire had reached the main floor. The burlap sacks of grain were beginning to smolder. He grabbed heavy horse blankets, attempting to beat back the flames, but the heat was unbearable. A flaming roof beam groaned ominously above him. He needed to get out. But as he turned toward the exit, a section of the loft collapsed, sending a shower of burning debris and a heavy wooden support beam crashing down. It struck Gideon's shoulder, driving him to the dirt floor and pinning his left leg. Smoke filled his lungs. He struggled against the burning timber, but the weight was immense. The edges of his vision began to darken. Suddenly, a deluge of freezing water splashed over the burning beam and his trapped leg. Gideon coughed, wiping soot from his eyes. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the flames, was Josephine. She had managed to awkwardly carry a heavy wooden bucket by hooking her elbows under the wire handle, severely bruising her ribs in the process. "Push it!" she screamed over the roar of the fire. With the flames momentarily doused and the wood slick with water, Gideon found the strength to heave the beam off his leg. He scrambled up, grabbed Josephine by the waist, and practically threw them both out into the freezing night air just as the roof of the barn completely caved in. They collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air, covered in soot and freezing water. The barn was a total loss, a towering bonfire against the dark Dakota sky. The wheat, the money, the farm, their entire future was burning to ash before their eyes. Gideon looked at Josephine. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, her chest heaving. The splints on her arms were soaked and slightly charred, but she was alive. "It's gone," Josephine whispered, staring at the flames. Burnett won. Gideon slowly pushed himself to his feet, favoring his bruised leg. His gray eyes reflected the raging fire, but they held no defeat, only a cold, terrifying wrath. He reached down and retrieved his Sharp's rifle from the dirt where he had dropped it. "No, Josephine," Gideon said softly, checking the breech of the rifle. "Burnett just changed the rules, and tomorrow, we're going to Deadwood." Gray light crept over the black hills, revealing the smoldering, blackened skeleton of the Caldwell barn. The morning was bitterly cold, the kind of freezing Dakota dawn that cracked stones and froze breath to men's beards. Gideon Cole did not wait for the embers to cool. He hitched Samson, who was still trembling and smelling of singed hair, to the small buckboard wagon that had survived the blaze. He wrapped Josephine in every wool blanket they possessed, lifting her gently onto the wooden bench before climbing up beside her. Deadwood in 1884 was a chaotic scar of civilization carved into the pine-covered gulches. Mud-rutted streets were lined with false-front saloons, assay offices, and the imposing brick facade of the Black Hills Miners' Bank. As Gideon drove the buckboard down Main Street, the usual cacophony of miners and merchants fell silent. The sight of the massive, soot-stained mountain man and the pale, injured widow beside him drew cautious stares. Gideon pulled Samson to a halt directly in front of the bank. He helped Josephine down, his hand resting securely on her waist. Her hands were still bound in their charred splints, throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm, but she held her chin high. She was walking into the lion's den, and she refused to let Amos Burnett see her tremble. Inside, the bank smelled of polished brass, cigar smoke, and greed. Amos Burnett sat behind a heavy oak desk, a ledger open before him. Silas and Coley slouched against the paneled wall nearby, drinking coffee from tin cups. Burnett looked up, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his neatly trimmed beard. "Mrs. Caldwell," he drawled, feigning surprise, "I must admit, I didn't expect to see you this morning. I heard a terrible rumor that your property suffered a catastrophic fire last night, a devastating loss of your harvest. I assume you've come to surrender the deed?" "We came to pay the mortgage," Gideon rumbled, stepping in front of Josephine. His massive frame seemed to shrink the opulent room. Silas scoffed, slamming his tin cup onto a table. "With what, mountain man? Pine cones? That wheat is ash. We saw it." He stopped abruptly, realizing he had just confessed to being at the farm. "You saw it burn, did you?" A stern, authoritative voice echoed from the bank's entrance. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Sheriff Seth Bullock, his iconic mustache framing a face carved from frontier justice. Bullock was a man who commanded absolute respect in Deadwood. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and his hand rested comfortably near the heavy revolver at his hip. He stepped into the bank, the floorboards groaning under his polished boots. "Sheriff Bullock," Burnett said smoothly, though a bead of sweat materialized on his forehead, "this is a private banking matter." "Arson ain't a private matter, Amos," Bullock replied coldly. He looked at Gideon, then at Josephine's bandaged hands. "Mr. Cole stopped by the marshal's office before coming here. Told me an interesting story about two riders stampeding a workhorse and then setting a barn ablaze." "Baseless accusations!" Burnett spat, standing up. "This vagrant has no proof. And regardless, the deadline is noon today. The widow owes $300. No money, no farm." Gideon didn't argue. He calmly reached into the deep leather pouch strapped to his belt. He didn't pull out banknotes. Instead, he withdrew 3 heavy, crudely stitched deer-hide bags. He tossed them onto Burnett's pristine desk. They hit the mahogany with a heavy, unmistakable thud. "Open them," Gideon commanded. Burnett hesitated, then untied the leather drawstrings of the first bag. Gold dust and heavy, raw nuggets spilled out, catching the light from the window. It was the purest placer gold, painstakingly panned from the hidden alpine streams of the high country over 10 long, solitary winters. There was easily $1,000 worth of raw gold sitting on the desk. "Count out your 300, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And then you write the receipt. Paid in full." Burnett's face turned a mottled crimson. His plan had completely unraveled. Silas, however, was not a man of high intelligence, but of base violence. Seeing the gold and realizing he was about to be arrested by Sheriff Bullock, panic seized him. "To hell with this!" Silas roared, his hand dropping to his holster. The room exploded into motion. Silas cleared leather, bringing his Colt up to aim squarely at Gideon's chest. But Josephine, standing nearest to the henchman, reacted with desperate instinct. She couldn't grab the gun, but she threw her entire body weight forward, ramming her shoulder and heavily splinted arm directly into Silas's ribcage. The impact knocked Silas off balance. His gun discharged, the bullet shattering the glass of the teller's cage instead of hitting Gideon. That split second was all Gideon needed. He lunged across the short distance, grabbing Silas by the throat and slamming him backward into the paneled wall with bone-jarring force. The Colt clattered to the floor. Before Coley could even draw his weapon, Sheriff Bullock had his own revolver pressed firmly against Coley's temple. "Drop it, son," Bullock warned softly. Coley raised his hands in immediate surrender. Gideon released Silas, letting the gasping thug slide down the wall. He turned back to the desk, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the trembling banker. "Write the receipt, Burnett." With shaking hands, Amos Burnett dipped his pen into the inkwell and signed the release of the mortgage. December brought the heavy snows, burying the Dakota plains in a pristine, blinding white blanket. The scarred earth where the barn had stood was hidden beneath 3 feet of snow, but the farmhouse remained a beacon of warmth against the brutal elements. Inside, the cast-iron stove radiated heat. Josephine sat in her rocking chair, a lap blanket draped over her legs. Her hands were free of the heavy wooden splints. They were still stiff, and she bore pale, angry scars where the Iron Reaper had torn her skin, but she could move her fingers. She held a cup of hot coffee, savoring the simple, profound ability to grip the ceramic handle. The front door opened, letting in a swirl of snowflakes and the freezing wind. Gideon stepped inside, stomping the snow from his heavy leather boots. He carried an armful of split pine logs, dumping them into the iron basket next to the hearth. He shed his thick wolf pelt coat, his breath still pluming in the warm air of the cabin. With the remaining gold, they had bought enough provisions to survive 3 winters, let alone 1. They had purchased lumber to rebuild the barn come spring and hired hands to help clear the debris. Burnett was under investigation by a federal judge, thanks to Sheriff Bullock's relentless pursuit, and Silas and Coley were breaking rocks in the territorial prison. Gideon poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in the chair opposite Josephine. He looked at her, his rugged, weathered face softening. In the high timber, he had only known silence and survival. Here, in this little farmhouse, he had found something far more terrifying and beautiful. A reason to stay. "Hands hurting today?" he asked quietly. "Only when the wind blows hard," Josephine smiled, lowering her cup. "But they are mine again, and the land is ours." She said the word ours, naturally, without hesitation. Gideon felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the roaring fire. He set his cup down and reached across the space between them, gently taking her scarred hands in his massive, calloused ones. His touch, capable of breaking a man's neck, was impossibly gentle against her healing skin. "Spring will be here before we know it," Gideon said, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her right hand. "Need to break ground for the new barn. Might need to buy another draft horse to help Samson." "We will," Josephine agreed, her eyes locking onto his slate-gray gaze. She saw no wildness there anymore, only a deep, steadfast loyalty. "We'll build it bigger this time, together." The frontier was unforgiving, a place that demanded blood and bone from those who dared to tame it. It had almost taken Josephine Caldwell's life, and it had forced Gideon Cole down from the safety of his mountains. But as the winter wind howled against the sturdy walls of the farmhouse, they knew they had forged something stronger than the iron that broke her hands. They had forged a partnership rooted in fire, blood, and the unbreakable will of the American West. If this tale of frontier survival, relentless grit, and unexpected romance kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the journey end here. Please like this video, share it with your fellow history and drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories from the untamed Wild West. Your support keeps these legends alive.